Actually, the English ruler Edward III embodies the ideal of a medieval monarch. So inspired was he by the legendary King Arthur that he sought to revive the concept of the Round Table through the establishment of the Order of the Garter, an institution that still exists today. However, to quote the brilliant Suzy Edge, the monarch was so reckless to live far too long. His decline began years before his death in 1377. His slowly deteriorating health is commonly described as senility, but it's probably not quite that simple. Welcome back to Lemmy History. Edward III reminds me in many ways of Henry V. England won some significant victories in the battle with France, but his end was not at all what the Night King might have wished for. However, it shows that even kings are only human. Finally, I would also like to present a relatively recent theory, which suggests that Edward may have had more in common with American football players and boxers than we might initially assume. The corresponding blog post is linked in the description. The king's mental decline becomes clearly palpable in sources from 1375 onwards. In that year, Edward III decided to withdraw from everyday politics as he was no longer capable of actively shaping it. He delegated this responsibility to his sons. Chief among them were his heir, the Black Prince Edward, and John of Ghent, who initially competed with each other for influence. However, Prince Edward was also gravely ill and would die before his father. He passed away on June 8, 1376. Edward III then made the final major political decision of his reign. He appointed his grandson Richard as his successor, rather than John, who had already made many enemies by that time. The death of the Black Prince was described as a national catastrophe. In Thomas Walsingham's Chronica Maiora, for example, we read, "And so when he died, all the hopes of the English died with him." From that point on, John assumed responsibility for the kingdom and for his father, at the king's request, as Walsingham assures us. As a contemporary, Walsingham's account is of particular value. But back to the king, Edward III nearly died just 3 months after his son. In late September 1376, he suffered from a severe abscess. Unfortunately, little is known about the course of this illness. What we can gather from the sources is that Edward experienced a brief period of recovery in February 1377. Interestingly, this pattern of temporary improvement is also mentioned regarding his mental health. Edward was said to improve from time to time. However, this phase of recovery is absent from Walsingham's account. On the contrary, he reports that in February, a parliament was convened by John of Ghent because the king was beyond hope of recovery. It's one of many contradictions surrounding the old king's condition. Edward III finally died on June 21, 1377, at Sheen, most likely of a stroke. According to Walsingham, John allowed several of the king's advisors, including William Latimer and Richard Stourey, who had previously been expelled by Parliament, to return to his side. The same was true for Edward's beloved Alice Perrers, who had once served as a lady-in-waiting to his wife. She remained by Edward's side until his death. Later, Alice Perrers was accused in Parliament of stripping the rings from the dead king's fingers, an accusation used to justify the confiscation of her extensive possessions. Her crime? According to Walsingham, she was brazen. But when did the king's health begin to decline? An especially interesting year is 1371. By then, the war in France had taken a catastrophic turn. In response, Edward III asked Parliament for funds to launch a military campaign aimed at reversing the situation. These funds were granted. The monarch intended to lead the army himself, which suggests that he still felt strong enough to fight. There is no indication that anyone around him doubted his capability at the time. The campaign was scheduled for August 1372. However, unfavorable winds prevented a successful crossing. Interestingly, these winds are said to have shifted shortly afterward. In the Chronica Maiora, we find the following entry. In the same year, in the month of August, King Edward sailed at sea with a large fleet and a very large army to lift the siege of La Rochelle. But an adverse wind prevented him from straying far from the mainland, although he waited for a long time on the coast for favorable winds. When he finally saw that he was not making any progress, he returned sadly. Immediately after his return, the wind suddenly turned in the desired direction, it is said. With him, his son, the prince, and almost all the nobility of the empire were ready to depart. It is reported that more than £900,000 sterling were expended in this futile expedition. There appears to have been no attempt to respond quickly to the change in wind and proceed with the campaign, despite the immense financial cost. The sum mentioned, over £900,000, is almost certainly exaggerated, as we know that Parliament provided £50,000. Still, there is no doubt that this was a substantial amount of money. In later years, it has often been suspected that it was not truly the wind that thwarted Edward's crossing, but rather his health. This theory is supported by the fact that the king never attempted another campaign himself. Instead, he delegated the task to his sons. During the preparations for the campaign, Edward's wife, Philippa of Hainaut, died. Although the king had likely already developed an intimate relationship with Alice Perez, Philippa's death was nevertheless a severe emotional blow. It is possible that Edward suffered a series of minor strokes in the years that followed, which further worsened his health. A lifelong enthusiast of tournament fighting, he now ceased participating. While this may partly have been due to his advancing age, it's also likely that his physical mobility was becoming increasingly limited. What is striking is the convergence of several major life events that coincided with the onset of his serious health issues. Edward lost his wife, gave up his sporting activities, and abandoned a costly military campaign, opting instead to delegate the responsibility. These factors suggest that his condition cannot be explained solely by simple senility. By the 1370s, Edward III's symptoms appeared to become increasingly uncontrollable, so far as the sources allow us to judge. The king appointed William Latimer as his chamberlain, thereby giving him control over who could access the monarch. Latimer shamelessly exploited this powerful position to enrich himself and secure additional prestigious offices. What we do know is that the king became increasingly uncommunicative. While this may have been a direct result of his declining health, that is not the only possible explanation. Edward grew increasingly passive and stopped responding to unfolding events. Among the aristocracy, the realization seems to have spread that something was seriously wrong with the king. Contemporaries attributed this troubling development to a mixture of grief and an obsessive attachment to Alice Perez. Parliament, therefore, targeted both Perez and Latimer for prosecution. Apparently, this campaign had the tacit approval of John of Gaunt and his allies. John could have chosen to publicly defend his father and protect the king's inner circle, but he evidently chose not to. This is particularly surprising given that, as previously mentioned, he was the one who would later enable their return to court. John himself was not free from scandal. His private life drew attention, particularly because of his deep affection for his then-lover and future third wife, Catherine Swynford. It is striking that Edward's health decline is only described as truly serious after the death of the Black Prince. The abscess that nearly killed the king is a modern interpretation of the medieval term ulcer, This word appears frequently in medieval sources and was used to describe any condition that doctors at the time could not fully understand, only that it was severe. We do not know precisely where the abscess was located or how large it was. It is only recorded that it burst in February, which is said to have led to a temporary recovery. It is also mentioned that it was large. Suzy Edge explains the significance of these factors. An abscess is a collection of pus, which itself is a collection of pieces of broken cells, the result of the body defending itself from infectious organisms and trying to contain the debris. There's a big difference between an abscess on a foot or leg and an abscess of the tooth, the parotid gland, or even a perianal affliction. As the immune system kicks into action, the area around an abscess can be painful, red, swollen, and angry-looking. If it bursts, it spews out the pus. Edward's was painful and gave off a terrible smell. On the matter of Edward's actual death, Edge writes, Edward's death mask exhibits a distortion, a drooping of the left side of his mouth, suggesting that he suffered a stroke. But a single stroke would not explain the cognitive decline that Edward displayed in his later years. Multiple smaller strokes over time, leading to cognitive decline and a final, larger, life-ending event in 1377 when he was 64 years old. There are, of course, differing reasons for cognitive decline. We must recognize that Edward was a Plantagenet, with the genes passed down through the generations associated with mental ill health. We can only speculate about Edward's death with the help of a few clues. His burial does not offer additional medical insights. However, we do have detailed reports of the process. First, the body was laid out and washed by valets. It was then thoroughly rubbed with balm and spices, worked into every skin fold and body opening. A knife was used to open the skin from the lower sternum, the xyphosternum, down the center of the abdomen to the pubic bone. The layers of skin and fat were pulled apart to create space for the removal of internal organs. The omentum, a fatty tissue that covers and supports the abdominal organs, the stomach, intestines, liver, everything had to be taken out. The skull was also opened and the brain removed to be replaced with oils and spices intended to halt decay. The body was then wrapped in several layers of waxed cloth, known as cerecloth. Each individual finger and thumb was wrapped separately, as if the king were wearing linen gloves. For the balms and oils used in this process, a Roger Chandler was paid £21. This ritual was not only meant to prevent decomposition, but also to preserve the body as perfectly as possible, in line with the ideal of an intact corpse, which was considered necessary for canonization. Edward was then dressed in a long tunic, with a silk scarf placed over his face. A ring was put on one finger and covered with a glove. A pole with a cross was placed over his chest, and the scepter was laid in his left hand. He was buried in Westminster Abbey alongside his wife Philippa. A torchlight procession accompanied the coffin, which rested overnight at St. Paul's Cathedral. Over 500 members of the royal household received black mourning clothes, and 400 torchbearers were fitted with black hooded cloaks. A gilded bronze effigy of Edward III still adorns the marble sarcophagus in Westminster. His head rests on a pillow donated by Queen Victoria. 12 decorated figures surrounding the tomb represent his children. When it comes to Edward's health, we are ultimately limited to biographical accounts. Many historians suggest that the aging king was lonely, having outlived numerous family members and close friends. Edward lost not only his wife and heir, but also his daughter Joanna, who succumbed to the plague that devastated much of Europe in the mid-14th century. In 1361, he also lost his trusted confidant, Henry Grosmont. Grosmont's title as Duke of Lancaster was passed to Edward's son John, who had married the Duke's daughter. The aging Edward is often portrayed as depressed. For example, I came across a note online claiming that Ralph Holinshed wrote Edward blamed himself for his heir's death, that it was divine punishment for having deposed his own father. I attempted to verify this but was unable to do so. The two versions I consulted are cited in the description of this video. In those accounts, Holinshed simply states that Edward entrusted the affairs of state to John. Edward's lack of communication and his refusal to remain involved in state affairs may well have been part of this depression. That alone does not necessarily argue against the theory of senility. It's possible that Edward was aware of his mental deterioration and that this realization itself became a burden. His extensive retreat into private life, often blamed on Latimer's manipulation and greed, may in fact have been a sign of this internal struggle. As mentioned, James Turner proposed a different theory. He explored the possibility that Edward III may have suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, the neurological disease now known to affect many modern athletes. CTE is a degenerative condition, meaning it progressively worsens over time. It is triggered by repeated head trauma, which Edward could have experienced during tournament fighting. The symptoms include memory loss, disorientation, physical weakness, and depression. One statistic Turner cites is particularly striking. Brain examinations conducted in 2017 revealed that 99% of active NFL players in the US showed signs of CTE. Among college football players, the figure was already 91%. In Canada, it stood at 88%. While there are no comparable statistics for boxers, it is reasonable to assume that the numbers are similarly high. However, the nature of these sports differs significantly from medieval tournaments. In mounted jousting, the head is not a primary target, as the lance is held under the arm and aimed at the chest. In contrast, in football, and especially in boxing, the head is regularly subjected to repeated impact. Still, Edward remained committed to tournament combat even during the plague years. The Order of the Garter, which he founded, continued to host tournaments regularly. These events aligned closely with the chivalric ideals Edward wished to embody. The strongest counterargument to the CTE theory lies in the recovery phases Edward is reported to have experienced. CTE typically does not allow for such improvement. The health of those afflicted with the disease generally follows a steady and irreversible decline. In the end, we cannot definitively say that Edward III was an early victim of a degenerative, sports-related illness. What is certain is that time and circumstance took a heavy toll on him and eventually broke him. Perhaps it happened much too late, as mentioned at the beginning, or perhaps too early, since Richard might have needed a few more years in his grandfather's shadow. But we cannot negotiate with history. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe